Hi, I'm Jon and I yet again welcome my dear friend Edwin Stratton. Hello, Ed.
Oh, yeah.
And we haven't got any idea what we're going to talk about. I don't know. What could we possibly talk about? I had this. I don't know whether you've had a look at the chats I've had with Mike Grinder or Karen de la Carrière recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. I've listened to the Mike Rinder chat. That was instructive. Yeah.
I was genuinely surprised and also very quiet because we had a lag on the Zoom and we were both recording our sound independently. So I just sat there going, all the way through.
Yeah.
Which nobody's yet put anything in the comments about that. You know, usually I'm told off for talking too much, but when I'm silent, nobody says, "Well done, Jon." You know. So.
Yeah.
But I was struck by it. You know, it's now 46 years or something since I first encountered the works of Ron Hubbard, and 37 years since I left the mother cult of Scientology.
It casts a long shadow.
It does cast a long shadow. And I really wouldn't have thought that, you know, when I left, I thought I'll spend 6 months helping people out and finding out what was really going on. And here I am, all these years later, still talking about it. Though, having said that, James Beverley, who I did a seminar with in Toronto, Professor Emeritus James Beverley, when I remember talking with him when we were starting to think about doing a seminar together, and he complained that his agent keeps finding him another book to write about, usually about Islam or something, because he's a professor of Christian thought and ethics. And he really wanted to write a book about Scientology because it's so much more interesting than anything else. And I think there is some of that too. It's a whole genre of material that
it's a fascinating subject. Even if you're not involved, it's a fascinating thing to read about. You know, that you can create such fanatics just with psychological techniques of persuasion and inculcation. You know, that you create somebody who has those beliefs. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
For the average person.
It is hard to. What struck me was that I've talked with more than 1,000 Scientologists over the years, or ex-Scientologists, and I've heard a lot of stories, and I've collected them and published them, and there was something so real about his account of the Apollo. And I've talked with people who've been overboarded and put in the chain lockers and all of this kind of stuff. Had a severe reality adjustment from Ron Hubbard. Something struck me that when I was involved, I only remember ever having one conversation with somebody who was on the Rehabilitation Project Force, and that was Phil Stannard, bless him, who was the only one-legged L. Ron Hubbard communicator at St. Hill at the time. And I get to know a little bit better later on, but the first time I met him, he was doing some gardening sort of thing, and I stopped and started talking to him. And that was that. I didn't know anything about what they did. And a friend of mine was put in it. Bob Rosenstein, my landlord, and he worked on the estates, you know, the supposed castle and all of that stuff. And he answered to a man called John Chadder, who was a deputy guardian in the Guardian's office, and a very proper Englishman, apparently. So I'm told. I've never met him. And Bob had been in the US Merchant Marine and was not a very proper Englishman. He was a very improper American. And
Yeah.
when John Chatter had asked him to do something, Bob had dropped his trousers and said, "Suck that."
Yeah.
Just the kind of thing you say to somebody who's, highly educated from an English school. I wish I had been there with my camera. For the look on John Chatter's face, obviously not for what Bob was showing. And that was it. He was put on the rehabilitation project force to land. He was my landlord, so he only came back on the Saturday for an hour that he was allowed out. But his wife was there, and they didn't tell me anything about what was happening to him. And Phil Stannard didn't tell me anything about what was happening to him. And in the 9 years I was involved, nobody told me that the Sea Organization were living on rice and beans.
Yeah.
Most of the time. After I left, somebody said, "No, it was okay on a Sunday. We'd get a baked potato with some cheese."
Yeah.
And you're sort of going, well, you basically accepted refugee camp conditions and then came and told those of us who weren't wearing sailor suits how fantastic everything was. This kind of Potemkin village,
Yeah.
I remember after I left, I was given advice by my friend Steve Kay, bless him, who I'm still in touch with. And he said that once you'd worn your socks for a certain amount of time, you could invert them and wear them the other way around. I had no idea what he was talking about because I could afford socks and we had a washing machine.
The privations in the Sea Organization are unique, I think, to any cult. I don't think people live in those kind of conditions anywhere else in the world. They're absolutely appalling. I got to see those conditions as part of the technical training corps. And they were reminiscent of Theresienstadt. People living, 20 to a room with beds stacked three high. People living in dark corners, even in corridors. It was like a ghetto. It was appalling.
Mike said something, he talked about the stench of the men's dorm.
Yeah.
With a 6'6" height and three bunks, and that if he wanted to turn over, he couldn't sleep on his side because there wasn't enough space. So he had to climb out if he wanted to turn onto his front, and no closets for clothes. And he said the food was disgusting, but then he added, but every Sea Organization installation I went to around the world, the food was disgusting.
Yeah.
And it just, all of my training came back to me. And I thought about the Data Series Evaluators course. And I thought about Hubbard talking about having created the most efficient management system ever known to mankind. In fact, Mike had gone there to study the FLAG Executive Briefing course, which he didn't do. And here he is. Hubbard is there. He's in charge. He's the man who gave us this expression, the ideal scene. And he's got the best management system in the world. And he's got the most elite group of people ever gathered. That's
the most ethical people on the planet.
The most ethical people on the planet. How could this be? How can you get people? And, I knew Captain Bill, I knew John McMaster, Otto Rose, Hannah Whitfield, and a variety of others. I met and interviewed a lot of people who were there. Nev Chamberlain, who were there pretty much from the beginning and went through it all. One of the people commenting on the Mike Rinder interview said that he didn't understand it. These were the best days of his life. Yeah. And then a few days later, I interviewed Karen de la Carrière, who, of course, is one of the handful or two handfuls of class 12 auditors, the highest attainable level of training in Scientology. And she just wanted to confirm one particular thing, that the men's dorm absolutely stank.
Yeah, I remember the smell.
Ideal scene.
Yeah.
Best management system in the world. Or as Ron Hubbard said in the Philadelphia doctorate course in December 52, we have ways here of making slaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he said, let's make sure none are made. But I think he forgot that bit. And that, it for me is, you know, when I read about, I was asked to go over the rainbow. I was asked to join Hubbard's musical group. And I could have been playing the drums on Thank You for Listening.
Yeah.
One of the, you know, and I would have worked with Chick Corea if I'd done that.
Yeah, that would have been good.
The now late Chick Corea. And they offered me a 1-year contract. And I said, okay, I'll go and play drums for Ron Hubbard. That sounds good. For 1 year. And then, of course, the next thing was, oh, no, sorry, we missed the zeros off. That's $1 billion year contract. And I said, no, not doing it. Later, I read transcripts from the Clearwater hearings where several people who'd been at La Quinta in the desert with Hubbard. I interviewed a couple of people who were there too. I interviewed Harvey Haber along the way, who worked there. And I remember if you were ill, they put you into this, they got this hut where they put all the ill people so you could catch the stuff they'd got too. And the temperature was, if I remember rightly, 102 degrees. That's Fahrenheit, just in case you were wondering.
Yeah.
You'd pretty much be boiling at that, frankly. And you'd be in this hut with no air conditioning with the other sick people. And this was the breakthrough technology for curing illness, no doubt. And the thought struck me, I remember reading it was at 84. I read the transcripts from the May 82 Clearwater hearings. I remember reading it and going, I don't know if I would have retained my autonomy in those circumstances with the degree of punishment that's going on. And I don't know, and I'm glad I don't know. I'd hate to think, well, they'd never have taken me in. They'd never have done that. But I didn't actually do anything that I regret during the 9 years I was in Scientology. I didn't con anybody out of any money.
Yeah.
I didn't spoil anybody's life. And all of the people I recruited left. So
yeah.
About 10,000 more besides, you know. But
I was pretty ineffective on staff, so I didn't manage to screw anybody's life up.
Yeah. Sad reflection. In your next lifetime, maybe.
My next lifetime, I'll be hatted.
Yeah, have a nice.
Therefore, I'll be cause on post.
Hat cause on post. I was surprised when I found out how literally Hubbard took the notion of hats, that when he was being a musician or when he was being he'd got different costumes.
Yeah.
Cosplay. And I interviewed Maud Castillo, who was his photographer aboard the ship, some of the photographs. And she asked me if I'd noticed that the peak of the cap was always pulled down. And I hadn't. And she said, well, I was talking with another friend about years ago. I thought I was upsetting him by saying all these horrible things about Hubbard. And so I said to him, what's the thing you most remember about Hubbard? Thinking he'd say, oh, he's such a generous, compassionate man. But he didn't. He said the lump on his head.
Yeah.
And he had a sebaceous cyst stuck out. You can see it in the photographs that Jim Dinkelsey took in Queens, New York.
Yeah.
Quite clear as a big lump, because he was terrified of doctors. And so it would have been really easy to deal with. But instead, he pulled his cap down
to cover his triceratops horn.
His triceratops horn. So it just doesn't add up somehow, you know, that the elite, the most ethical, the best business system, that it's actually a way of making slaves. And again, I looked at the various human trafficking cases that have been essayed against Scientology. I think the Headleys were involved in one of those. Exceptional and lovely people, by the way. And I still absolutely recommend Blown for Good by Mark Headley as my favourite ex-member account, because it's funnier than any of the others.
Yeah, I read it. I was reading it when it was online, when it was serialized.
Yeah.
And it was great when he was writing as BFG before we knew it was Mark Headley.
The big friendly Mark Headley. I haven't got it up here anymore. There's a story about the IRS event where Miscavige comes on the wrong side of the stage and almost gets the javelins thrown at him. And when they're recording his speech, one of the cameras has gone off, and the other one, the guy's eaten an apple, and he somehow managed to get spit on the lens. Or no, one of the cameras is turned round onto Shelley Miscavige's breasts.
Yeah.
And I think he said it cost him like $180,000 to actually seg in a little clip so you could hear the triumphal speech. But it's good to know what your donations buy. Though actually that issue, what your donations buy, was originally called what your fees buy. And that was one of the religious changes that happened, that word was scrubbed out and then our donations. But human trafficking, and it was only really with, I've got the idea people have been moved out of countries and over state lines. I got it. It was only really with talking with Mike. And he said, well, his parents had paid the money for him to go over. He was 18. He was 6 when his parents got into Scientology in Australia. He was on staff at the Australian organisation, and he gets to Lisbon and he gets aboard the ship, and he's going to do the FAG executive briefing course, and he's told, no, you've been traded.
Yeah.
Instead, I think 2 FEBC graduates or something had been sent on a mission to Australia. So instead of having somebody who was fully hatted, who'd know how to do this, they cut a couple, 2 missionaires for 2 weeks, and his passport was gone. He had no money left.
Yeah.
18, and here he is.
Yeah.
A slave. He's, being put into appalling conditions, which you just wouldn't find anywhere in the civilized first world, the prosperous world. And there he stays. Now, we have there's a guy called Robert Horsburgh, who's on the interviews I've given with Mike. He comes back and he wants Mike to apologize to everybody he's harmed, to admit his crimes. And he actually, the last time he gave a set of questions, he wanted to know about Mike's relationship with his son. And I kind of went, that's their business.
Yeah.
He wanted to know if Mike was working with the FBI. And I said, well, I hope he is. I hope he's working with the IRS particularly.
Yeah.
But when they're doing investigations, they don't particularly publicize what they're doing.
Yeah.
But there seemed to be this focus of, which for me is very dangerous, that, I was a whistleblower, but I hadn't actually been involved in doing any of the horrid things. So I don't really think of myself, I'm not like Jeffrey Wigand. I'm not employed by the tobacco industry to make stuff up.
Yeah.
So I've never really thought of myself as a whistleblower in those terms. But Mike's a whistleblower. And it's going to be the case, if you're going to be able to blow the whistle, you've got to have been involved in some of the dirty doings. And to discourage anybody from doing that in a world where, I wrote a response to Robert Horsburgh today, and it said, I was offered a lifetime salary if I would go silent about Scientology.
Yeah.
Because they'd learned that giving somebody like $1 million or $800,000, as it was in Jerry Armstrong's case, doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be silent. So what they took to doing was offering a monthly salary. And I was told that they would arrange with an art dealer who would not be a Scientologist, who would buy work from me. And happy I would be. And I have a tape recording of that. But I'm probably never going to make it public because it would keep going expletive deleted, just like the Watergate tapes, because I was a bit rude to Greg Ryerson, who made this offer to me. But I'm pretty sure that Mark Rathbun, or Marty Rathbun as he used to be, I'm pretty sure that that's what's happened with him, that he's on salary now, the great Scientology warrior who is going to rescue the tech and do all of that.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that Mike would have been offered something similar, and he chose instead to speak out.
To get an Emmy.
To get 4 Emmys. Yeah. But I really had that there, but for the grace of feeling with him, because he's a smart guy. He's evidently an empathetic human being. He cares about people. He is not, the twisted psychopath that one would expect.
No, and people rarely are. It's a different personality that you exhibit while you're in the cult compared to who you really are. This superimposition of a mask, it warps people for the time that they're involved, and after they get free from the cult, they can revert back to who they actually are.
Looking pensive.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the attitudes that I had when I was involved versus the attitudes that I had when I quit. And after not a long period of time, they gradually fall off, these sort of attitudes that you have, that the tech works and that Scientology is this thing. They gradually leave you, and somebody like Mike Rinder, it might feel satisfying to people to say, for all the things that he did while he was in the cult, he should apologize and that. But as long as we've got a truth and reconciliation kind of process going on, nobody needs to get punished for what they did while they were in the cult. It serves no purpose whatsoever. We've only got to look at truth and reconciliation processes for various in various theatres, in various situations around the world, to realise that it's actually a superior process than hunting somebody down and saying, right, you did this, you bad person, And
I mean, he's still liable for criminal actions that have not gone beyond the statute of limitations. Now, as he's been out for 16, 17 years, the statutes have probably run out on everything but murder. But and some part of it is the Scientology thing, the write up your overts and tell us all the bad things you've done.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that I hadn't really intended to become involved in, the autobiography of Mike Rinder. I just wanted to talk to the guy and get to know him. We chatted a couple of times. We really got on. And I became interested in his perspective. And it was almost by accident that we had the conversation we did, because I wanted him to watch the piece that I did with Steve Hassan, Christian Shirko, and Chris Shelton in Toronto on deconstructing training routines and stuff like that, and talk about that, see how he felt about that now. But he didn't get a chance to watch it. So there we are at the start of the conversation, as we were at the start of this conversation. I'm sort of going, all right, well, you were 6 years old when you folks got in Scientology. You turned up the Apollo, the flagship, at the age of 18. Tell us about that. And I was just mesmerized. It just came out piece by piece. Finding that he was the only Scientologist left in Funchal on Madeira after they'd driven the ship out and thrown all the motorbikes. And Mary Sue's car, I'd never heard about that. That was her Mini was thrown into the water. But that, there he is in this situation where basically the natives are baying for blood, and his is the only blood available. And had he not managed to strike up a friendship with the captain in the army, he'd have probably been chucked into the water too. So the stories are never ending. But I think that maybe this is that process of truth and reconciliation.
I think it is. I think Marty Rathbone's not engaging with it, and I think Mike Rinder is.
Well, Marty just, forgive me, but he's a narcissist. He's so. And I have said publicly that we shouldn't declare people. I'm not saying he's got the narcissistic personality disorder. This is not a diagnosis. But his Scientology Warrior book was the first ex-member book that I couldn't finish. And I've read tens of the things, some of them just in manuscript form. But he was so, egotistical, so self-centered. It was, I didn't see any concern for anybody but himself. And now he's gone. And that's good for us all. Having led as a warrior, the great crusade to maintain Scientology, he's now decided to go off and do something else instead. But Mike stayed with it, and it will be interesting to see. Our next episode, we're going to meet Ron Hubbard for the first time. I've been told this thing, and you probably know it because you know these things. I've been told that at Nuremberg it was decided not to try anybody who was under 19 when Hitler came to power. Anybody? Is that true? Have you ever heard that?
I've not.
No.
I've not heard that before. That they tried nobody under the age of 19.
Well, who had been 19 in January 1933, 19 or less. The presumption being that they would have been indoctrinated by the system thereafter. And I have no idea where I picked up that factoid, but it does seem to me a very sensible thought that if you were schooled in this,
if you had been aligned by the state,
then the responsibility does.
You're not as culpable as you could be if it was your idea in the first place.
If you're an adult at the time when you came to the system. Certainly looking at the stories of Hitler Youth reporting on their parents, or young Scientologists writing knowledge reports about their parents, one can see that there's a certain resonance there.
I was thinking about second generation SEAL members. They've been so thoroughly indoctrinated from the start that you can't really say that they're rotten people, in spite of the fact that CMO, particularly CMO, you've got this sort of obnoxious stereotype of a sort of a 13-year-old who has a position of power and is told to rip people's faces off and to go around and give people severe reality adjustments, and you meet a few of these kids and you think they're nasty pieces of work, but when you realize that they have been thoroughly indoctrinated by the cult, then you realize that there's maybe something that you can that you can rescue from that. There's something salvageable from that personality, because if you get them outside of that totality and into society itself, then they will change. They'll be forced to. You can't live in society as a Scientologist.
That's for sure. During the takeover period, I left on the 18th of October 1983 to celebrate the anniversary of the Mission Holders Conference, and I later found out the birthday of my good friend Christian Shirko, who I didn't know at the time, so I wouldn't have done it if I'd known him.
So he didn't send you a card.
Yeah, exactly. Here's my resignation birthday letter. But so about 2 months later, I opened the door to this young man. He was 14 years old. We'll use his first name because that's not too dangerous. I did identify him in print later on, but his first name was Gulliver. And which led me, of course, to write a piece called Gulliver's Travels. You know, it's not hard, is it? No, really. The Trials of Lemuel Gulliver. But this lad arrives on my doorstep, and his stepdad has told him, yeah, here's the address, go there. He hasn't told him who he's going to be meeting. And so he was a little shocked when I introduced myself.
Yeah.
And he explained to me that he was 14. He was the second in command in the United Kingdom for Scientology.
Yeah.
And I could have had images of the Khmer Rouge coming out of the jungles and
Yeah.
Year Zero.
Yeah.
When I looked surprised, he said, "Oh no, there are in the Commodore's messenger organization, there are kids as well." So he was 14 and he was talking about 10-year-olds. And he'd become a little concerned because one of the things that they were being asked to do was to go and give severe reality adjustments, screaming matches, to people for their sexual misconduct. So you'd have a 12-year-old going and yelling at somebody for having had sex with somebody else or something like that. And of course, I don't know if it's an aspect of David Miscavige's personality. The Apollo was I have talked with people there, and that there was a lot of sexual activity taking place. I mean, what else are you going to do? The food's disgusting.
There always has been on board boats, isn't that a weird thing? Boats have always been orgy central.
Rum sodomy and the lash, as Winston Churchill said of the but Miscavige seems to have gone. He's gone the other extreme. That for the most part, authoritarian groups are highly promiscuous, say the Rajneeshis, or very austere, say the Shakers. Though they did give us the washing machine and Shaker furniture. So, but they are now extinct because they didn't have sex and they were finally prohibited from taking children from orphanages. That was the end of them. So not necessarily the best recruitment method. They've all gone to heaven though, so it's all right. But so we now have. I mean, I had documents that came out of St. Hill in south of England in 1990 or somewhere around there, where a stack of documents that this guy had brought out, and I had to say, no, I'll take photocopies, but not the originals. That would be theft. The originals have to go back. I'd read the law by then.
Yeah.
And in these documents was a woman who had been punished for holding hands with another woman.
That's out 2D.
Yes, out 2D, the second dynamic, sexual dynamic. And she was therefore a lesbian.
Yeah.
For holding hands with another woman, who in fact was her lifelong friend. They'd been to school together. They, I think, were still in their teens. And as I recollect, the punishment was to be put into an underground cesspit, which had been emptied, you'll be pleased to know.
Yeah.
For 3 days, I think it was. And
that cured her homosexuality?
Of course it did.
Yeah, it will.
So,
conversion therapy involving ditches.
Yeah.
With cockroaches.
Cockroaches. And did you ever hear about Rat Sally in Los Angeles?
Yeah, in Big Blue.
Big Blue. So,
yeah.
Talked with 2 women who were put into Rat Sally, and it's where the ducts are and all of the pipes and the things run
Yeah.
between the floors. It's
Yeah.
about 4 feet high. There's no light in there. And they were put in to clean it. And they were put on little trolleys that they
Yeah.
could scurry along with. And then they'd scrape stuff off the floor. And it was inhabited by it's called Rat's Alley. Bit of a clue in there.
Yeah.
You think about that and then put alongside it the idea of a man who had come to release humanity from the consequences of trauma.
Yeah.
Something there that's not quite working for me. That, the Dianetics is going to get rid of the trauma and get rid of your reactive mind and make you rational and logical. And here we are chucking people overboard from the ship because they were 2 minutes late, or
You're improving their confront, though. That's what you're doing. By tossing them over the side of the ship, you're making them confront things, and by putting them in Rat Alley, it's improving their TR0.
I'm told it was Nietzsche who said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
I think in his case, it can be proven that what didn't kill him drove him bonkers. That 15 years insane at the end there. Probably syphilis. It was very common at the time. But what an amazing notion, that if what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, you'll up your confront by being hit on the head with a plank of wood. It really...
You get case gain.
Yeah.
You get actual case gain from being put into appalling situations.
And then you see that the suppressive is surrounded by cowed and ill associates who've been banged on the head with a plank of wood. And you wonder about that one too. Richard DeMille, who wrote Science of Survival and How to Live Though an Executive, from Hubbard notes, he didn't make any of it up. But I think it was a mess because Hubbard was hugely drunk and would recount these things onto these tiny little green dictaphone discs. I had the privilege of actually touching one of the discs that Science of Survival came from. But DeMille became a professor of psychology, I think at UC Santa Barbara. And when he'd read what is now Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, he wrote to me this wonderful letter in which he said, "This is the best book I've read about Scientology. And believe me, I've read them all." And he said, and the thing I particularly like is that you identify Ron Hubbard as the suppressive person.
Yes.
And you look at it, you look at what he did to people. One of the worst stories for me that really hit home was people on the film crew at La Quinta. He decided they weren't working hard enough and they didn't deserve any privileges.
Yeah.
But there wasn't really much of privilege left to them. So he declared that they should have no more toilet tissue. And so this guy was telling me these stories about them, going further and further out, stealing the phone books from telephone boxes. And you go, he left $648 million. And that's just what he didn't manage to spend. They boasted to the Rocky Mountain News that he had a camera collection of 2,000 pieces.
Yeah.
And yet, no toilet tissue. For the people who are working, quite standardly, a 16-hour day for him. So the money is flowing in. He's got lots of money, but they're not doing enough.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about the free zone. It's interesting that in the free zone, L. Ron Hubbard is still this wonderful figure. This, the freedom of mankind comes from L. Ron Hubbard. He's still source in the free zone, but they've spotted all the evil things that the SEAL do. They've seen that bit of it, but they daren't look up. They daren't look and see that these orders actually came from source. So, the flag orders and the all of these dodgy ethics conditions and RPF and all of this stuff comes from source. He wanted it to be brutal.
Hmm.
People used to write to Hitler thinking that Hitler doesn't know about these rule breakages that are affecting me badly. So I'm going to write to Hitler. If only he knew, he
Keeps
wouldn't
it up.
allow this kind of thing to go on.
Hmm.
And it's the same with any totalitarian regime.
And interesting that it's a German proverb that says a fish stinks from the head down.
From the head down. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the free zone. I mean, watching that as it happened, I may even have been the first person to use the term independent Scientology. That's how far back I go.
Yeah.
And I was right at the middle of it, facilitating it. I wasn't making any money from it. I wasn't auditing anybody or training anybody. But I felt outraged that this organization, which I believed was trying to help humanity, had become corrupt and perverted. And I believed that it was time to exteriorize Scientology from the supposed Church of Scientology. At that time, I didn't know that there was no such entity as the Church of Scientology. It's a fabrication we believed in. There was the Church of Scientology of California, and later there was the Church of Scientology International. But the actual controlling group is the Religious Technology Center.
Yeah.
As reorganized around about 1981, 82. And so I came out and I saw these things happening. Firstly, I very rapidly stopped believing in Ron Hubbard because I saw Michael Lynn Shannon's collection of documents, which is about an 18-inch stack of documents. And, he'd got his college records in, failed his course in atomic and molecular physics, nothing about nuclear physics at all, quite a different subject, in fact. That, he'd screwed up in all sorts of ways. And I saw that he was a liar. And for me, the path was then irrevocable. If the road to truth can only be trod with true steps, this was not the road to truth.
Yeah.
If honesty is sanity, then L. Ron Hubbard was not sane. And I pretty quickly started to gather the contradictions, which were things he'd said, because I realized that you can't persuade people with real documents because they'll say they're faked.
Yeah.
I was talking with Vicky Ballard, who'd been the commanding officer of St. Hill Foundation. And she was most upset with me because I'd stopped believing in the tech, and she came round to tell me off. And no, she came round to tell me that she'd realized why I'd left, which was that I'd realized that Hubbard had mocked it all up so that we would unmock it, something like that, I will waste your time so you realize that you've wasted your time, which is pretty much, I'm told, what OT8 is. So
yeah.
That's oh dear. Don't give you the money back, though. That's the interesting thing. But when I said to her, look, it's the same old one. My philosophy, crippled and blinded at the end of World War II, abandoned by family and friends, wounded with physical injuries to hip and back. Notice he says physical. Liars do tend to underline things that you need to look at. Faced a non-existent future. Year in Oak Knoll. Crippled. Blinded. And then go back from that, which was 65, my philosophy. And it's the handwritten version of it was on display at St. Hill, so there's no argument. There's a professional auditor's bulletin from 1957 called Communication and Business, where he says that he was feeling out of sorts because he'd failed to get his foreign posting. He didn't want to go to Korea. And so he went down to Hollywood, and it was around about July the 25th. I'm kind of going, but you're crippled and blinded, Ron. He then beats up 3 petty officers. Now, I was able to trace that he did get into a fight with 2 petty officers. That bit is true. Not 3, 2. As to him breaking a bottle and using his judo to cut them up, that doesn't seem to have been the case. But nonetheless, that he's one place saying, I'm crippled and I'm blinded, and he's the other place saying, and I beat 3 people up.
Yeah.
Now, I've since had it, somebody said to me, that was his necessity level. And you're going, yeah, okay, that's very interesting. He stopped being blind for a few minutes there.
Because of the necessity of being...
Necessity level. So why didn't he use his necessity level to stop being blind afterwards? That's what I'd like to know. But
yeah.
Two stories. There's a third one, which is an interview he gave with Look magazine in December 1950, where he actually does say what his war wounds consisted of. He had conjunctivitis, pink eye, very nasty. He had ulcers, which his medical records show were never actually found. He just claimed he had ulcers.
Yeah.
And, as far as evidence goes, he had fallen down a ship's ladder at some point, and there was something wrong with his feet. That's as much description as you get. Those are the war wounds. That then he's beating up petty officers, then in 57, and then 65, he's crippled and blinded. And we then get the mission into Time, where he really goes to town and says, he was the first officer injured in combat, and we get all of the bullshit about him being on the Edsel when it went down off Australia, and Paulette Cooper, my good friend Paulette Cooper. It's so easy to not check every fact, and with Ron Hubbard you have to check every fact, because in Scandal of Scientology she talks about him rowing to safety from the sinking of the Edsel. And he talked about having machine gun bullet wounds. Now, nobody survives with a machine gun bullet wound because that's a hole this big, they're not tiny things. And I looked at the map because that thing I was going to check. He rode at least 700 miles with a wound in his back from a machine gun bullet. Now, who needs Dianetics when you've got those supernatural abilities? He makes up all these stories. Anyway, with Vicky Ballard, I said to her, the 1957 beating up petty officers, crippled and blinded. And I hadn't realized the answer. And she said he had two bodies. So then I said, he didn't actually see active service in World War II. I've read all 800 pages of his Navy records twice. And he didn't see service. And she said, yes, he did. And I said, how do you know? And she said, I served alongside him. Which should have been my chance to get from her at least the names of the ships they were on together and some of the crew and stuff like that. But I was just flabbergasted. It was just like, how can you believe this? She later came to disbelieve all of this. But it is that fascinating thing of I will somehow find some way of fitting this together. So that, the cognitive dissonance goes away.
Yeah, and you shoehorn in the most absurd things.
Yeah. And you find yourself trying to justify why you spent so much time immersed in this nonsense,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this week, somebody again posted a fairly obtuse comment on the Karen de la Carrière interview that I did, and said that I was part of the controlled opposition.
Oh, the controlled opposition.
Controlled opposition.
Yeah. So you're not really a critic of Scientology, you're working for them.
The controlled opposition, yeah. The Markavians, possibly, or
probably
somebody else. And
the Jews.
Yeah.
Probably.
Probably.
Always the Jews.
Zionista.
Yeah.
So, as often been said, you put two rabbis in a room and you've got three different opinions, So much for the conspiracy. But how we construct our mindset. We talked about QAnon.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the possibility of writing something about QAnon. because it's a way of saying, how do people come to believe abject nonsense?
Yeah, why do people believe weird things?
Yeah.
To quote Michael Shermer.
Michael Shermer, good old Mike. We've got Michael Shermer right here. I've got two of his books actually here, but the one that's to hand is Denying History.
Denying History, yeah, about Holocaust deniers.
Yes. And I thought it was a very good book, but not the kind of book I could recommend to a Holocaust denier, unfortunately.
No.
So I'd like that book. Because, I mean, I was fascinated by it. There's a discussion of history. The first third of the book or something, it's quite a significant chunk, talks about how history is made and recorded. Yeah. And it's too easy to kind of go, well, you know, yeah, history is made by the victors or Mississippi of lies or what have you. But the reality is that there is a modern scientific history. And as somebody who's engaged in this, where, you know, I was fascinated. I don't know, I was about 20 or something. And I read a book, a history of King John of England, of whom A.A. Milne said, King John was not a good man. He had his little ways. And sometimes no one spoke to him for days and days and days. He has the worst reputation, probably, of any English monarch.
Yeah.
What had happened was that W.L. Warren was writing a huge book about John and Richard the Lionheart's dad, Henry II. Richard the Lionheart came to the throne in 1188. King John succeeded him in 1198. And we get all the Robin Hood mythology, which is a complete mythology.
Yeah.
But he has a very bad reputation. And Warren, what had happened was that when the court travelled around the country, which it did, because that way everybody got fed, but not at the king's expense. So it was a really good idea. Henry II had introduced a new set of laws, upon which indeed the Roman Catholic Church based the laws of the Inquisition, which was not simply a torture thing. It was meant to be a court. It was meant to be a very influential lawmaker, Henry II, though he did play cards in church, they say, which is not good, apparently. What happens is that they kept daily records called the pipe rolls, because they were rolled up and encased in clay, I believe.
Yeah.
And nobody had unsealed them. These records had existed all of these centuries. And in, I think, the early 1950s, historians decided they'd have a look at them. And they found that they were in complete contradiction to the history of King John.
Oh.
He was the first king since William the Bastard, William, as he was called in his own time, William the Conqueror, as he's called now, who came here in 1066. So we're now going up to 1198. He's the first king of England to speak English.
Yeah.
Where his father had charged, I think it was 200 marks to hear a case, he would hear a case for 2/3 of a mark. Traveled the country dispensing justice. They have the cases, they can look at them. It seems that he couldn't be bought off as easily as was usual among the nobility. Then you find out who his biographers were. That was the bit where it started to get interesting. All of the biographies right through to this time in the 50s when Warren wrote this book were somewhat biased. The first was Roger Wendover, who was a contemporary of King John's, and he was a monk at Canterbury. The next was a man called Matthew Paris, and there's a contemporary called Matthew Paris, but I don't think it's the same man.
No, it's not.
He was also a Canterbury monk. And you then inject into this story what happened at Canterbury, that when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, at the very beginning of the 13th century, I think, not long after John had become king. The monks appointed their own archbishop. This had never happened before. It had always been the gift of the English king. And so the king said no and appointed his archbishop. So the monks sent a delegation to Pope Innocent III, who is the absolute turning point in history, that man. He's an astonishing, incredible man. Devastating. He caused the first genocide of heretics, the Albigenses or Cathars. He ordered that. He created the Inquisition based upon Henry II's ideas. He launched the Fourth Crusade, having gone to Venice and asked for the money to launch a crusade. The Doge at Venice said, "There's nothing left in the Holy Land. You've had it all. What about Constantinople?" And so in 1204, Christian troops arrived and screwed over their Orthodox brothers in one of the most vicious campaigns in history, and they occupied the place for 25 years. So that's all Innocent III. That's what he's up to. And his solution is that he sends his archbishop. So his man's going to be in charge of Canterbury. John refuses him entry to the country. John is excommunicated. Ultimately, the whole of England is placed under interdict, meaning that no religious ceremonies can be held. So John then confiscates the housekeepers of all the priests. They're not allowed to marry anymore because somewhere in the 11th century, a pope had realized how much money it was costing keeping the wives and children. So for 1,000 years, it was okay to be married in a priest, as it is in the Orthodox Church. Only monks were expected to be celibate. So this clever thing came up. So they had housekeepers and they had children by them. And John confiscated all the housekeepers. So, the priests were completely stuck. They couldn't do their own washing up anymore. They didn't know how to boil an egg. And they got all these bloody children to look after. So it kind of went downhill until ultimately the plot against John leads to Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which was largely a power grab by the barons. It didn't do anything to advance the cause of the common man, other than introducing the law of habeas corpus, that you could not behold the body. You couldn't hold somebody for more than 24 hours without charging them with a crime, which of course was something that Tony Blair was only too happy to get rid of. A fundamental aspect of British democracy and justice that, along with just about everything else, he managed to get rid of. But John finds himself, so let me recap, that he's got a real beef going on with the monks of Canterbury. And the monks of Canterbury are the people who are going to write his history. So what Matthew Paris does is he takes Roger Wendover's account and he adds things to it. He adds a lot of quotations. Now, he was not a contemporary of King John. John was dead. But he keeps adding these blasphemous statements that he attributes to him. And you get this complete piece of propaganda that's created. And on it goes. The point being that history isn't just the opinions of people. There are documents. There is evidence. And in the work I did in finding out about Hubbard and Scientology, it became very evident if something doesn't fit into the context, it's probably not true.
Yeah. That's the problem with conspiracy theories, is they have no context. There's just a dot and a dot, and you've joined them arbitrarily. And now you're Adam Curtis.
Yes, who will be the target of a video that I'm making. It's a crazy thing. For years I've been, such a huge fan. And, there's Clive Pilger, and his hair's a bit dodgy, obviously.
He has got very dodgy hair, Pilger.
And he does seem a little bit fond of himself.
And Putin, funnily enough.
And Putin, too. Yeah. Then there's the great Naomi Klein, and I won't hear a word said against her. She's fantastic.
Naomi Klein's great.
She is Canadian. No, you won't get into that.
Oh, the Canadians.
But Adam Curtis has been, a hero of mine. I don't mind using that word. Power Nightmare, Century of the Self, hyper normalcy,
Hypernormalization.
normalization. These are great things. Then I find this 2012 video about deprogramming, where he just talks complete nonsense. It's the Scientology deprogramming manual, and he's not done any research.
Yeah.
So we find that I will actually do a video about this at some point, so I better not let all of the scoop out. But for example, he confidently asserts that Edward Hunter, the journalist, was a member of the CIA who was the first person to use the word brainwashing. Now, putting aside the fact that brainwashing is a literal translation of the Chinese sinao, wash brain, which is the term used by Chinese people, not by the government. They call it re-education, and they still do. But that was what it was commonly called, brainwashing.
Yeah.
But also, the first time that Hunter used the term was in the Miami News in September 1950.
Yeah.
Well, the first time it was used in English was in the Times of India in January of that year. So, and he wasn't a member of the CIA. The Hunter archives show he was a member of the OSS during World War II. So, of course, he'd have been connected to people who were in the CIA, no doubt. But he wasn't a member of the CIA. And he wasn't the first person to use the word brainwashing. And he didn't invent what it means. Now, this is a little sidestep. And Adam Curtis has been known to do similar things before. So, for example, when he talks about Al Qaeda and says the name was invented by a court in New York, which it probably was, the base, Al Qaeda.
Base.
But that's as if that's actually important. What's important is 9/11 did happen.
Yeah.
Muhammad Atta and 17 others did what they did. That the news around that, the media around that may be inaccurate is important. But we have to watch out which details we flag up. Whether Edward Hunter was in the CIA, whether he invented the term brainwashing is irrelevant. The Chinese camps from 1949 to 1953 processed millions of people in horrible ways. That we can then take that word and pretend that all forms of influence are now called brainwashing. That things like education, for example, anything that influences you, anything that gives you, could be brainwashing. And that we then blame Margaret Singer, who I did have the pleasure of knowing, and say that she sold the idea that brainwashing was being used, and people were then kidnapped and deprogrammed. Now, anybody looking at the history of the subject, and Adam Curtis is a historian, he has access, he can read, will find that kidnap deprogramming was almost gone from the world by the early 1990s.
Yeah.
People like Stephen Hassan, particularly, Carol Giambalvo, had an influence where non-coercive work was being done. What Curtis comes to is that no harm has been done by a new religious movement, as he chooses to call these authoritarian groups, except to those who have been kidnapped, deprogrammed.
That's a rather sweeping statement, isn't it?
It is. Since leaving Scientology, I've talked with more than 600 people, not one of whom was kidnapped, deprogrammed. Not one of whom didn't have a horror tale to tell me about their experience in Scientology.
Yeah.
And, I know of deaths. I know of many suicides. I know of all sorts of horrible things. Putting a 4-year-old in the chain lockers aboard the ship was apparently the work of kidnapped deprogrammers who were seeking to discredit Ron Hubbard. My point about this, and it shocked me 24 hours after I saw this thing, it's on YouTube. It's called Memory Marathon for some reason. 24 hours afterwards, because I placed so much faith in this man's skills as a researcher, as a man who believed in truth profoundly. And here I was being shown, he pretty much could have read it from Scientology handout.
Yeah.
It was not accurate. It was not anywhere near true, and would have been very easy to disprove. You could, for example, have read Stephen Kent's paper with Joseph Zimhart in 2002, which is broadly available, and was, explains how kidnap deprogramming went away. When people like Joe Zimhart decided they weren't going to do it. And Joe, of course, was found not guilty in a trial on the grounds that it had been necessary to kidnap this person because their own process, their locus of control had been lost. So a judge ruled in his favor. He nonetheless decided he didn't want to do it anymore. And that was, I think, 91 or something. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. The
point is really this notion of authority, this notion that somebody can be trusted as the absolute authority. My partner was saying to me the other day, she said something about Giotto, the Italian painter from the early 14th century, submitting a drawing for a commission for the Pope by drawing a perfect circle freehand. And this story, and I kind of went, I don't remember that story. I've heard it attributed to Raphael. And because she's a lot smarter than me, she looked it up. And she was absolutely right. It was Giotto. Meant to have done this thing. I don't believe it. I don't believe, because I went to Vasari and read what he said about it, which is where the story comes from, a 16th century account. Giotto died in 1336. It's just a story that's been told. Nobody, and the way that Vasari says he would put his arm against his body to draw the circle, I'm afraid it doesn't work. And Vasari should have known that because he was a painter.
Yeah.
And I've never seen any drawings from the early 14th century anyway. So why a Pope would be asking for drawings? Drawing only became common in the 15th century. Of course, they didn't have pencils because pencils were invented in the 19th century. They had silver point, little bits of lead wire or silver wire, and they had sanguine chalk, which is what Da Vinci used. But painters like Titian, for example, who's a contemporary of Da Vinci's, he never drew anything. It goes straight on the canvas. So I'm not sure about those details, but the details don't matter. What matters is that my partner was right and I was wrong. What I, if and when I make this video about Adam Curtis, that's what I want to emphasize, that he should be valued for the work he's done, and we should not trust anyone in terms of factual information. We should fact check. We should
fact check.
Yeah, and not presume that anybody remembers everything perfectly. Certainly not me, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, after many years of silence in 2013, I did one TV thing for a friend in 2012, but otherwise from January 96 on, I didn't talk about Scientology. They didn't stop talking about me. But I just didn't want to do it anymore. It's just been too painful being crushed and really not having any support from ex-members, whether they be independent or not. They just went off and did what they were doing. Or indeed from the state, from the courts, from anywhere. There was no support. The CIA didn't come or the Markabians and throw money at me. And I found myself, I just became exasperated. I didn't want to do it. But in 2013, when my friend Steve Hassan came over towards the end of 2012, he said, look, can I record an interview just in case you want to come back? And a couple of months later, he broadcast it. And in the interview, I'd said that Quentin Hubbard, Hubbard's oldest son by his third marriage, he didn't have a second marriage. He had no second wife. So by Mary Sue, that after Quentin was busted down, he'd done everything. He was OT7, he was class 12, he was as high as you could get, and all of his certificates were stripped from him. And I was told, while still involved, that he'd actually retrained and done everything a second time.
Yeah.
And so I said this in the interview. I can't remember why it came up. I think it was probably to say, even if you've done all of this stuff, he committed suicide. He was Hubbard's son. This has got to mean something, and that's putting aside the conspiracy theory that he was murdered. We won't get into that here. The autopsy certificate seemed good enough to me. That's as far as I checked, and his state of mind at the time. But Dennis Ehrlich, who'd been the case supervisor at the time, said, well, yes, his certificates were cancelled, and I did set up a program for him to retrain, but he never retrained. And that's fair enough. Good to know. I stand corrected. That's the way it should be. But Monica Pignotti added the comment, if Jon is wrong about this, can we trust him about anything else? And I hadn't counted the reference notes in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky then, but I did in the end, because there must be something wrong with me. But there are more than 1,100 reference notes in that book. All you have to do is when I say, Hubbard says the law can be used very easily to harass, you go and look it up, and it says 1955 Manual on the Dissemination of Scientology, and you can go and find it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think being able to admit that only the Pope is infallible, the rest of us are not. And it would seem that Pope Frank is actually quite openly admitting to fallibility. He's doing his best, I think.
Yeah.
He cleaned up the Vatican Bank. We've yet to see whether he will acknowledge the high degree of gayness that exists among priests, and let them, let them be.
Yeah.
Talking about letting them get married in South America for some reason. Priests get married there. I don't know. I think because the priesthood is waning so badly. But infallibility is not an aspect of humanity, and we should, I think, be willing to say I'm wrong about some things.
Yeah.
And encourage people to check. Encourage people to say, well, no, actually, it was Giotto, or and not have that, because that is authoritarian. This idea that somebody knows the truth, and I mean, curiously, that particular story, it comes back to me. Hubbard said it was Michelangelo who could draw a perfect circle, but in the false data stripping bulletin, he also said that it was Socrates who invented the syllogism, that you argue by having a thesis, an antithesis, and you make a synthesis. And of course, it was Aristotle. So right there, false data stripping, the false data stripping series. He does name Aristotle in the Phoenix Lectures, but it's such, the 30 years that it intervened, the false data had crept in. So it goes. Well, here we are. And do you think that's enough? Do you think people will shower us with money and accolades for what?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's inevitable, really.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, let's wind up.
Yeah.
I'm Jon Atack. This is my friend.
I'm Edwin.
He's Edwin Stratton, my dear friend. These last 25 years now, is it?
Yeah.
Whew, amazing.
Yeah.
We've had a jolly good time all that time.
Blimey. Getting old.
Yeah. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled, in the words of T.S. Eliot. He was 21 when he wrote that. Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time, everybody, and we'll see you again next time. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. Rum sodomy and the lash.